And we are live here. This is the live edition of the Unsolicited Response Show, where we cover the monthly three top stories as well as a win, fail, and prediction for the month. I'm Dale Peterson. Welcome to the show. As always, you can put in comments, questions, and we'll respond to those as they come in. First of all, I just wanted to, as a little bit of an introduction, I hope you all had at least for our U.S. viewers, had a happy Thanksgiving. It was nice to be able to get back together with friends and family, I'm sure, or I at least hope you were able to do some of that. And now we're charging in. Today's December 1st. We're charging into the last month of a very interesting year. So I know everyone's going to be really busy here, at least for the first 2 weeks. But I hope you have some time at the end of the month to enjoy it, again, with your family and friends. A few things have happened recently. Yesterday, I put out in my weekly article, I put out my update on the OT visibility and detection space. I do that maybe twice a year. So this was the last one for 2021. It's really changed a little bit in this article. I didn't so much focus on positioning and such. The big three have kind of separated themselves, and we've got some other participants. What I really did in this article was say what's going to be the biggest challenge for the major players, each one of them in 2022. So I'd encourage you to check that out. As always, I like your questions and comments on that. I've gotten a lot. You can imagine some of the vendors are happier than others. But also I got, for example, a really good comment that I didn't have Armis in there. And I think that probably was a mistake. I'm not sure where they fit. I don't think they're big three, but I have some information on that in the article. They're a cloud provider of this, but they're big enough that they probably should be in the article. So it's not perfect. I take input in all the time. And again, your comments and questions are welcome on any of my analysis. The last thing I wanted to say before I bring on Patrick Miller is that S4 is cranking along. We're up to 372 registered attendees, which is about in line with what we had in S4 20 when we had 700. So it looks like the event will have somewhere between 500 and 700 people, if I was to predict right now. We have, for a theme of the event, no limits. And it seems like COVID is kind of playing ironic on our no limits theme. But what we did with that is we relooked at every single element of S4. And if you went to S4 before, I think you're going to see a lot of really cool improvements in terms of the staging, in terms of the social events. There's a huge number of events happening around S4. For example, the first ICS for ICS exercise. We've got some birds of feather planned. There's a pwn to own competition with $300,000 worth of prize money and a variety of other things. So I'd encourage you to check it out at s4xevents.com. I think it would be a mistake not to mention the elephant in the room, which is COVID. I think we are planning on putting out an article on how we're going to handle that actually this week or next week, but we might hold off till the middle of the month to get a handle on this Omicron variant and just see what that's going to be. We are in a good position, though, in the sense that we do a lot of it outside. So our social events are all outside. We have a big tent outside. So we're going to move more of the breaks outside. And if you want to sit and talk with someone, there's a great place to do that outside in Miami South Beach in January where the weather is nice. So I'm optimistic still about it, but we'll deal with the facts as they come in. And as always, you can check out the cancellation policy and such. We don't want anyone to be out of pocket because they're unable to attend because of COVID. So we'll deal with it. But right now, we're going full bore forward with it as an in-person event, and we'll probably give you an update on exactly what kind of rules and restrictions we'll have in mid-December. With that as an intro, Liz, why don't you bring up Patrick Miller? Patrick Miller has been on the show before. He's well known in the industry. He is founder and CEO of Ampere. Patrick, I think last time you were on the show, Ampere was just getting started. What is this new company of yours going to do?
Yeah, thank you. Ampere, did a soft launch for a while. Another consulting firm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I have a history of consulting firms, and this is my next one. It's industrial cybersecurity primarily. We do some physical security too. Of course, with my background, a lot of regulatory stuff as well. So,
Do you see anything different in terms of services or customers you're going to approach as opposed to, previous consulting firms?
in a lot of cases, I'm moving up in the chain. I'm doing a lot of work with directors and officers. I still have all the technical people to do those jobs as well, but myself personally, I'm doing a lot more at that level.
Yeah, I find that to be more interesting. I think after you do so
Yeah,
many all levels are important, but
yeah,
also, I don't know about you. I found that my technical skills deteriorated. So I was actually less effective at the lower levels. I mean, I always had a technical person with me, but it really was a combination of my interests as well as my skill sets that had me moving up the
yeah.
stack a little bit.
I agree, and the same. I mean, I used to be able to do all the technical things, and now it takes me a while to kind of remember what to do or ramp back up in that space. So I have gravitated more toward that executive space, primarily just because the education there is needed. They need to understand what's going on. They need to understand it in their terms, in their words. So I saw a need and went to fill it.
And you have that great session. We'll link to it in the show notes here on the podcast version of this and on YouTube when this comes up later. But you had that great session at the on ramp on talking to executives. And
Yeah,
we are seeing more often than not that sometimes that's the linchpin to get things started. Getting the right message to the executives, getting them on board to do the right things is, yeah, you can have all the stuff working at the lower levels, but if you don't have that, it's really difficult to make systemic progress, I guess, in
yeah,
a
yeah. It is.
situation.
Yeah, it's the funding, the support, just the mindset. There's so many things that come along with it, but everyone says tone at the top is what really matters, and it does. It does. I mean, it's hard to get, but it really does matter.
You always have those good sayings, tone at the top. I like that. I steal so many of them, but I usually give you credit. Okay, so right now, again, if you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, feel free to enter a question or comment. But let's dive into the first story, and really two of the three stories, Patrick, are up your alley. So that's why I wanted to invite you for this month. In November, the American Waterworks Association, AWWA, which is one of the leading industry sector organizations for water, commissioned a report on how cybersecurity regulation should be approached and standards should be approached for the water sector. And the quote I pulled out of that, they said that the water sector would manage the standards development process and associated implementation, and that the organization that they envisioned, this Water Risk and Resilience Organization, this WRRO, would be funded by the water utilities. And if you dug into the report even more, it was very NERC CIP like. So it was essentially, they actually pointed to it. They said, this is how it was done in NERC CIP. This is how it was funded. This is how the regulation went in place. We think EPA should play the role of FERC, and this new organization, WRRO, should be the ERO, which NERC is now.
Right.
I saw you followed that up with a blog entry, but let me step aside here and let you give some thoughts on what you think of this approach for the water sector.
Yeah, I couldn't let that one go without a rant. It just couldn't let it pass. I think the short story is NERC CIP did move the needle for the electric sector. It was necessary, right? But I think over time, what we ended up with is something that it probably needs to be looked at again, to be honest. And again, with this tone at the top stuff, dealing with executives, I think about this. If I were an executive running a company and I had to deal with, let's just say, multinational regulations or possibly even multi-sector. So maybe I've got multiple types of operations that I'm running. God forbid it's both, right? Where you're running both gas and electric in multiple countries, for example. I'm going to want to know where's the high water mark of things I've got to meet to satisfy all of those regulations, because I don't want to have custom programs for all of my different facilities in different locations. Just the scale of that doesn't really work. I mean, it's not feasible, to be honest. So when I think about this, if the federal government is going to try to, well, not try, if the federal government's going to allow each sector to kind of self-manage and come up with their own regulations, we're going to end up with this really mixed hodgepodge patchwork of various standards. And they're going to, they're probably going to be borrowing some things from other areas. I'm sure they'll probably borrow from NERC CIP if they do something like this. Interestingly enough, the TSA didn't borrow much from NERC CIP. They kind of went off on their own tangent. So it's not a guarantee by any stretch. But we end up with like the TSA pipeline security directives. We're probably going to see something for surface transportation coming soon from TSA, and for aviation coming soon for TSA. And we're going to see this turf battle between like TSA and DOT, like we see a little bit with DHS and even NERC in some cases. So I think this kind of fragmentation and fractionalization, it's causing the organizations that have to do this, it's causing a lot of pain. It's causing a lot of frustration, difficulty, because there's just no standardization. And the question always comes up. It's a bad question. It's the wrong question, but it always comes up. How secure are all the infrastructures? And if you're using all these varying standards, you really are having, from a comparison standpoint, it's just impossible. I mean, you can say, well, this one's doing it this way, and they're this secure, but this one's doing it that way, and they're that secure. But when you want to look at this kind of holistically, it breaks down really fast. So I think though it is a bad question and it's the wrong question, it's going to get asked, and it's going to get simplified, and it's going to get reduced down to, are the infrastructures at least X secure? And unless you can measure that across the board with at least some degree of consistency, you're always going to come up with an "it depends" answer, which is even worse than the stupid question. Because then it becomes too murky, and then they want to drill in deeper, and it just causes more frustration and wheel spinning. So though it might not be the best approach, it's a good enough approach to standardize on something that is equivalent, at least for all of them. I think most can agree that if you're at least in the US, like 853, 882, it can be applied to all of those infrastructures, arguably. Even NERC CIP has been mapped to them by NIST, right, through the CSF. So it's that, if you're going to try to regulate, getting some degree of consistency across the board is going to be very, very useful, at least to have that conversation of where are we? Are we at least doing some minimums in all of these infrastructures?
Well, we'll get to Vivek's question in a second, because I think it's a good question, but I want to dive a little more into this. So I understand let me take a step back. One of the things they talked about was the importance of the water utilities having some influence on what the standards would be. And I think almost everyone says what TSA did was wrong, where they just went in a back room and said, here's a bunch of security controls that you got to get done. It was kind of a panic move, really, more than anything else.
I think it was a knee-jerk reaction. Yeah.
And I think they'll learn from that, and I think they'll bring the people in. So I don't think anyone would argue that there shouldn't be some consultation prior to regulation or standards. But I was curious, what about this electric has ERO. It's always been this issue that the utilities set the standards, the security requirements that they're going to be audited to against themselves. There's always a little bit of this conflict there. Like, do you want to set the minimum level of standard, or do you say, well, no, we need this so that the grid stays up? They're kind of proposing the same thing in water, where they're saying, hey, we'll decide what the right security requirements are. This lack of independence, even though from a maybe organizational standpoint, strictly on paper, they're independent, they clearly are influenced heavily by this. And I guess I would worry about the water sector saying, this is what we need to do. Makes me nervous. That was one of the things with the NERC CIP NERC being the ERO that always just never sat well with me. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, self-regulation is challenging. I mean, it really, really is difficult. you know, there's an old saying, you can't smell your own breath. It's
Yeah.
really hard to do self-evaluations, which I see a lot of these, even if it's something like a C2M2, when I see organizations did their own C2M2 versus when an external party helped them, it's very difficult to evaluate yourself. And you have, I mean, honestly, most organizations are pretty bad at risk. They're not great at it. Just be honest about it. And I think the hard part is every utility, every organization, every infrastructure thinks that they're unique. And they think that we know our systems better, we know our world better, and they do. But there is, at some point, there is a commonality to all of these things. I mean, if you back out far enough, SCADA is SCADA, right? It's whether it's boxes on a belt, power on a wire, water in a pipe, it's flow control. It's kind of it's the same thing. And we use a lot of the same technologies across the board. The way they're used is a bit different, right? And things like water, where it's really localized, there's no transmission system, it's just distribution. And there's a lot of other kind of existing physical controls in place there. Yes, it is different. But that said, you could still apply something like an 853 and 82 to it and still get a good result. It doesn't have to be your custom crafted, unique standard,
I think that that electric had at least the advantage when it comes to self-regulation that since they all are interconnected, they sort of rely on each other doing their jobs. But if I'm a water utility in San Francisco, a water utility in Virginia failing doesn't really affect me at all.
Right.
So there's this little, I would think there'd be more impetus to say, let's keep the regulatory bar as low as possible. We may choose to do more from a security standpoint ourselves, but there's no benefit to us to putting hard rules on ourselves. So I think the independence issue is probably bigger in almost every other sector than electric. Same with manufacturing and other. They just
chemical too. Yeah.
I guess manufacturing, you could say supply chain stuff. You might have some interdependencies in that. Well, let's go to Liz. Let's put Vivek's question up. He was asking if, and I'm not as familiar with foreign electric sector regulations. Have you seen any that you said, hey, this has been more effective than NERC CIP?
I've seen some. I noticed Dick put the one about Ireland. Ireland's got a decent model. Germany's got a decent model. I've seen some that have really, I think the difference is it's hard to compare because a lot of those systems, Ireland's an island.
Yeah.
Right. It's not the interconnectivity of that doesn't span 3 countries. In the US, like for a power system, for example, it goes from Canada to Mexico. So what happens on one, it's like a spider web. You pluck it and it happens, it affects the whole system. So it's hard to map these things directly just based on the country. And in a lot of cases, whether it's electric or gas, or even in some cases water, there is a varying degree of federally owned or nation owned versus municipally owned or privately held. So that mix is very different and has a very big impact on how these regulations unfold. So it's not easy to just say some other country did it better and here's what theirs looks like, because that model doesn't always apply to the same economic construct that we have.
Yeah, this is why I'm always jealous of Singapore, because they have such limited things and so much power that they can do things that just would be completely infeasible in most of the rest of the world.
Right. It would break down.
Now, Blake has an interesting comment here, and we could get down a rabbit hole here. He says that the self-regulatory organization model is also used in the financial sector for financial regulations.
Yeah.
I guess we could argue how effective those financial regulations have been. I think there's some questions about those given some of the incidents we had, but I'm not an expert in that. But thanks for the comment, Blake.
Yeah.
I had one other thought on this, though. I thought that when I read the report, I didn't know what was going to be in the report, obviously, but the report was essentially writing, this is how we would implement a NERC-like model, a NERC-FERC-like model in the water sector. I would have given it a little more credibility, the report, if they had analyzed other regulatory models. Why did they just say, this is how we could do what is done in the electric sector? Why didn't they say, well, we could have a government regulatory model per sector? We could have an overarching regulatory model like you suggested across the sectors. And who should be this this ERO or WRRO, even
Yeah.
if they, a lot of times on these studies, they know where they want to be before they start, but at least they would then have had to say, we looked at these other models and here's the pros and cons, and here's why the model that we think is best is best. And I
Yeah.
just didn't see that. It would just leapt to this, and that bothered me a little bit.
I agree. And a key part of this, though, Dale, is not just the standard, and that's where everyone gravitates. Is the standard is the NERC CIP standards? Do they map to other controls? All of that discussion aside, it comes down to what's called the monitoring and enforcement component.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, the CIP standards, they were great when they were written, and it's not a bad standard. Some of the language, obviously, is a little outdated and that kind of thing. It's got its warts. But in general, the concept of each one of those requirements is great. Now, that aside, monitoring enforcement is the key component. Let's look at the audits that happen for NERC CIP. I mean, it's pretty much at the auditor's discretion to have this wide latitude of interpretation in many cases. Look at what TSA does with the security directives and the mandatory actions that they've got.
Mm-hmm.
So what is this going to look like for the water enforcement space? Are they going to have some performance-based standards? Are they going to have control-based standards where they, actually have controls and control tests and you get some continuous monitoring output? Or is it going to be kind of the choose your own adventure style of NERC CIP where you have to kind of show the auditor all of this mountain of evidence to determine whether you did or you didn't do what you were supposed to? So it's more important to me is the monitoring enforcement component, because honestly, the standards are all the same. I mean, it's just the same stuff mixed up in different ways and called something else. All the controls are basically out there. I don't think there's anything new.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing, and I exited NERC CIP pretty early, probably about, probably like 2010, 2011. I said, this just isn't for me. When it became clear that you needed to almost be a full-time NERC CIP to really understand it.
Yeah.
But at the time, it seemed highly inefficient.
It is.
It raised the floor, but it didn't seem like a model that I would want to say, if we're going to spend resources on security, this is the way we would do it.
It is highly inefficient. I can confirm.
Well, so that might be the next thing that AWWA should sponsor is, what would they change if they were going to do this? What would they change if they were going to take a NERC CIP approach and say we're going to have a WRRO and EPA and we're going to write a set of standards? What did we learn that we would do differently from NERC CIP? I think that might be worthwhile, because when I saw people starting to create spreadsheets full of all the services and open ports and all that for every cyber asset, I was just thinking, oh my goodness, this is not the way to do it.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Okay, well, let's move on to our second topic, which is also related to NERC CIP, I guess, in a broad sense. It's in the electric sector. This month we had Grid X6, which was 700 plus people, 2 days. It's an event, an exercise run by the electric ISAC. And it's happened 5 times before. This was the 6th one. Have you ever participated in Grid X?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I never have. I have been in a utility when Grid X2 was happening. And what was, the people were dealing with it. So I was actually in a room with people that were participating in Grid X and hearing all the grumbling and such. It looks like, though, that it's gotten better. I looked at the report from Grid X2, and a lot of the lessons learned were kind of generically. They said we need to continue to enhance information sharing, coordination, incident response, situational awareness. I mean, very, very broad. But then Grid X5 had a couple that were a little more, I guess, substantive and action-based, in the sense that they said, for example, we should have a shared inventory program, or we should incorporate pipeline owner-operator.
Yes.
Sort of thing. So it seemed like maybe it was getting better from your standpoint. And I know you talk to a lot of people in the electric sector. What's the big value of Grid X?
Yeah, I would say the big value is it's, first of all, it's a well-run incident response exercise with, in most cases, realistic or plausible scenarios. I
Okay.
mean, they pretty much throw everything at you. I'm surprised that the next one's probably going to include something like an alien invasion, because it's an all hazards approach, right? It's everything from squirrels driving backhoes. But it is good. It's comprehensive. It's well managed. It helps organizations that you get a free incident response exercise. It also can help you learn how to do them yourself, should you want to do these, at another time. So you
Mhm.
get an idea of what good looks like, or what's par, right? And it involves a lot of the organizations at once. So you can work with your peer organizations. If you're part of like an ISO or an RTO, you can work with anybody in your chain, for example. If you're a generator, you can work all the way up to your balancing authority, for example. So that I think it's good, because it does bring a lot of the organizations together under one roof for a common exercise that's well run, well managed, well conceived. So there's a lot of value in it.
When I don't know if they still do it, but they used to do cyber storms. The government used to do these
Yeah.
cyber storm exercises, and you could write the press release before the event took place. It was a
Oh, yeah.
success. It
Yes.
brought together all these people, and I don't want to downgrade that or mark it down or denigrate it. Bringing people together, getting them to talk. There's value in that, especially organizations that typically don't talk. I mean, heck, I put an event on that. that's part of what we do. So I see the value in that. I guess my question is, do they really dive into lessons learned? Like, do they actually say, this didn't work? If we had actually had this incident, this would have been a disaster. We need to deal with this. Do they look at it hard, or is it just roses and flowers?
That's a very valid question. There is some roses and flowers to it. I mean, it is. I mean, I'm not going to call it a PR stunt, but it is. There is a lot of publicity around the event for lots of good reasons, and
Yep.
it's that this is not a bad thing that this is happening. It's a good thing. Do they drill down into the lessons learned? Yes, to a certain depth. So at that level, I'm not going to get as my specific utility. If I'm like a cooperative in the middle of nowhere or an irrigation district and I participate, my specific lessons learned may not be addressed at that level, right? But it is addressed to a certain depth.
Have you run into utilities that walk away from Grid X and say, we internally need to do these, 1, 2, 3 things because we learned something like that?
Yeah, they always get something out of it. I mean, it's rare that they participate and get zero benefit. I mean, that's
Yeah.
pretty uncommon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think it's a worthwhile exercise. Maybe you don't want to share the warts, in the press release. Maybe as long as there's documentation behind the scenes that said, hey, this would have been really bad had this actually happened.
Yeah.
We are completely unprepared. We need to do these 3 things in the next 6 months, and here's the actions, and here's how we're going to measure them.
Yeah.
Then it could be a huge value.
Yeah, I mean, the lessons learned will definitely be characterized in a way that they look like, one opportunities. That yeah, I mean, you're right. They're not going to show the warts in the press release. No. But there are some of those that do get discovered. And even down at the specific utility level, they come up with some of them on their own.
Yep. And this is also true with incident response exercises in your own organization. I find like the first, and maybe since it's so large, it's never going to go smoothly. The first ones are almost more educational than they are validating that your incident response process works. It's People are learning it. But at some point when you go through those, you start to evaluate what you did and start to have remediating actions against people or processes if they're not able to achieve what they were supposed to achieve.
Yeah.
That's probably impossible for an exercise this large with this many people to actually, point fingers saying you need to do this better.
Yeah. They won't point out any specific utility. That's for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
Okay.
they should do incident response exercises. I mean, honestly, my pitch to them is always, your operations knows what to do in the event of an ice storm or a hurricane or anything like that. Your incident response for cybersecurity should be the same.
Yep. All cause. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, let's get to our last story. This one is probably one I know a little more about because Idaho National Labs has their consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, CCE.
Yeah.
Hey, I remembered that. I didn't even write down what CCE broke out to, and I remembered it. So that's a feather in their cap that I finally have that memorized. But they have the CCE program. They've had it for years. They finally put out the book. I've done a show with Andy and one of the other participants from INL on that. But then they're starting to get partnerships. So they had first a partnership with 1898, the Burns and Mac Cybersecurity Consulting. They have a partnership with the water sector's West Yoast. And then this month they announced a partnership with Black and Veatch, which is a 10,000 person, $3.7 billion engineering company. So they have this methodology that is incredibly process driven, pretty heavy manpower driven. I think that when they did it at Florida Power and Light, it took 6 months or more with many, many people involved. I mean, you're talking about many man years of works, a lot of process, a lot of documentation. To me, I thought this was a major step forward, though, that they're starting to get these partners, because INL can only do so many of these.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, to me, this seems like the perfect partner for them, these large engineering companies that deal with methodologies. What do you think about them as partners, or who else should they be going after for partners, do you think?
I think it's an excellent partnership. I mean, it is an engineering basis, the whole CCE thing. That's kind of what it's designed in. It's building in those engineering, physical safeguards in addition to the other things that we're doing. So, adding these engineering firms is a massive complement to the program. I mean, I think it's starting to not just, go from concept to reality, but reality with legs. This gives it that kind of, and I think if they pick up other, Black and Veatches, similar organizations, it's basically the level of adoption is going to expand and improve, which is, in my mind, it's a fantastic model, and it should expand and improve.
Yeah, I think that they're probably better positioned now. They do. One of the things that's a little misleading about CCE in terms of the title is there's a tremendous amount of traditional cybersecurity work in there. There's in their steps 2 and 3, which I'm not a big fan of. They essentially redo everything that you would suggest someone do. Full asset inventory, full assessment, full, all these sorts of things that have really very little to do with consequence. They have to do with likelihood. So in theory, you could have someone like a Deloitte, an Accenture, an IBM, someone like that involved with this, but I don't know that they'd be, I guess I think I'd say INL is approaching it the right way. I wouldn't preclude them from doing it, but these others seem a little more logical to me.
Yeah. I think it's more their target space versus an INL or Deloitte or any of those. an Accenture or a Deloitte or the big consulting firms. I think the big firms like to have their own, not necessarily secret sauce, but we'll call them custom methodologies, where they've kind of combined things that in theory are better because they're this, aggregate of other really good ideas done their special way. And that gives them some unique differentiator. To borrow this methodology in whole would not necessarily devalue what they're doing, but it would almost distract from their custom approach. Where a lot of engineering firms, they're engineering based, right? It's physics. So this fits right in their wheelhouse.
Yeah. It is interesting though, that if it's maybe a little harder to differentiate it if all these engineering firms are doing CCE certified, because there is a process in which you create this partnership and then you send people through training, and eventually INL's working through this. Then you could get competition based on price, which I know these engineering firms prefer not to just go straightly based on price, a CCE assessment. That's an interesting point. The other thing about this, though, I think is pretty clear, is this is not something that really lends itself to a small firm in terms of being a partner. I mean, even when I had 15 people, I could maybe do 2 of these a year then, maybe. Probably not, probably 1 a year with my small 15-person team. So you really do need these large ones. The thing I'm less sure about is this West Yoast is trying to tailor it for the water sector. So they're saying these are common engineering issues, basically cyber physical attack engineering issues related to water systems. As you can imagine, there would be ones with electric with the protection and safety systems that are in place there. I wonder if there will be more of these sector-specific CCE targets.
Probably so. I mean, even if they're using, the CCE as a basis, they're still going to have some differentiators to it. I mean, we've both been in the consulting world. That's you got to have something different to make it worth value other than just price. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you think about it, if you've done one refinery, for example, you would know, okay, these are the engineering issues related to a refinery that could cause things to go boom. And this is how they could be affected by cyber. So we're going to go in with these models and accelerate the whole process. So it is possible. I could see the tailoring. We'll have to keep an eye on that.
Yeah. I do
Okay,
think it's going to happen.
Now we get to the fun part. And please, if you're out there, type in your win, fail, and prediction. Oh, I like this Blake's comment.
Yeah,
He's saying
I saw the same.
speculating these CCE engagements will be delivered as part of larger EPC contracts rather than standalone. Interesting.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be easier to bundle it in at that scale, but like doing this kind of retroactively is going to be a much heavier lift than building it in with a new EPC.
And then the EPC could be hiring your Burns and Mac, your Black and Veatch to do that because they bring in a lot of people. Yeah, Blake, I think you might be onto something there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's look at wins, fails, and predictions. This is always a fun part of the show. I will let you go first with any of the three. Pick your favorite: win, fail, or prediction.
Well, I guess we'll start with the win, fail, prediction order. Win, I think Apple suing the NSO group was a win.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I mean, really, in no uncertain terms, Apple's got more money than God, and Apple's got probably enough attorneys to make a difference in the space. I mean, I think didn't Facebook sue them for the WhatsApp issue too? I mean, what it's doing is it's setting a precedent. When you do something like this, there is likely going to be some legal ramifications to it. And if it's done by big enough organizations with enough attorneys, they can even basically exhaust the other party's, funds until they, you basically you economically beat them down with attorney fees over time till they have to, give up or, in some way change what they're doing. So it is a method to affect change.
I think you might get a little bit of pushback from that from the security community because there, if I understand the case right, it has to do with the finding and selling of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it does, but I also think it has to do with the usage of those things too. It's not just because this has always been a touchy space, right? It's never been, clear. It's never been defined there, and there are some absolute pitchforks and torches on both sides. That there's masses of angry people on both sides of this. But I do think what it does is it brings it out front and center in a very public and well-funded case, so that we'll see where this goes. But in my mind, this is a win because it's going to change the landscape. It's definitely going to make a big impact.
Well, I could agree with you that it might be a win because it will force people to start asking these questions.
Yeah.
For example, Nicole went into this a lot in her book, Nicole Perlroth. This is How I Think the World Will End, or something close to that title. Yeah. It was on a bestseller list. Good book. And chapter 2 is on an S4 dinner, so I really like it. But if the U.S. government is buying these, are you going to start suing the people that sold to the U.S. government?
We don't know where this is going to go, right?
Yeah. So I agree with you, Win, in the sense that, okay, this now is going to be out there, and maybe there will be some parameters that people will say these are the rules. Although, again, I think a lot of the market that we might be most concerned about won't follow any rules.
No, of course not. No, they're not going to follow the rules, but it will help us get the conversation out there. It'll get the dialogue more public. It will create some norms, and norms are still important. I mean, you can't just, pretend they're not. They are important. Legal boundaries are important. We have to know where the lines are. We may not like them, and if we don't like them, we can do action and request change. But it's got to have some. It's got to have a path. Otherwise, it's murky, and it ends up with people basically pushing in all directions. So I
Okay.
think the fact that it brought the conversation out front and center was a win. And like
Okay.
I said, it's big, it's public, it's well funded. We're going to see some change.
Okay. My win and fail are related, so let me hit them together. And my fail really isn't a fail; it's more of a loss. I just wanted to note that we really lost an important person of the community, Alan Paller,
Yeah.
uh, from SANS this month. And while he wasn't specifically involved in ICS or security or OT, he was really the driving force in getting that started at SANS and bringing on the right people to make that happen. And if you look at it, whether, I hear differing opinions about the SANS training, but we have to admit that the SANS training has probably trained more people on OT security or ICS security than anyone else
Yeah.
with their classes. They have
Yeah. Without
very
question.
structured programs, a lot of courses, and that wouldn't have happened without Alan. And he accomplished a lot more than that. I was not close with Alan. A lot of people were and have very fond remembrances, but just from a pure community standpoint, I just wanted to recognize the huge impact he had on the workforce in getting this training started. And I'd even go further. I'd even say that the SANS training probably encouraged other people to create training programs because they saw, oh, SANS was successful with this. So
Yeah.
maybe ISA said, hey, we should have a 4-part certification program and such. So really a big loss. And I just wanted to note his contribution.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that, Dale. That's awesome. Yeah. Alan was amazing.
And then I guess the win is a bit related to that. So he has, one last SANS win is SANS has this new course called, and I think you'll appreciate this. I wrote it down here. ICS 418, ICS Security Essentials for Managers.
Yes.
Which is a 2-day intensive course. And they're just coming out with that course. And the first one was sold out.
Yeah.
So we need to get a lot of mid and senior level management trained on this. So it was great to see this course finally come out. And it was great to see it sell out in its first edition. So that's my win. What was your loss for the month? Or your fail? Actually, your fail.
Yeah, the fail. Yeah, and first acknowledging that SANS class is going to be really awesome. JD, good friend of mine, helped develop it, and he's always got excellent management advice. Yeah, someone I even look to for that area as well. So I'll be taking the course for what it's worth. I say my fail. I think there's a bunch of them that are all like little failures all over the place, of course. But the one that kind of at least rubbed me the wrong way this month was the Vestas ransomware issue. And again, we have a case where yet another company doesn't really have a good approach toward responding to this publicly. I look at like the example, of course, the bar that was set was the way Norsk Hydro did things. I mean, they really set the bar for how to publicly disclose what happened, work with all your partners, and manage the incident. Vestas, for like others, I mean, Colonial is another example of it's murky. We don't know. We're not going to talk about it. And then finally, it comes out with what happened, and even then, it's very little detail, and the customers are still really frustrated with how things were handled.
Okay. Yeah, I think that those risk matrices that you see. I'm sure you've seen many of them, like the 5x5s with likelihood on one and consequence on the other.
Yes.
And then consequence has all these columns, and reputation tends to be one of the columns in a lot of these risk matrices.
Yeah.
So there's 5 level of consequence to reputation. And I've had some discussions with people in this risk management. I said, look, we need to work on our response. So if this happens, the reputation consequence is not a catastrophe or major, it's a minor. And we can reduce it by having an appropriate response. And I think that it's called incident response. It falls into incident response, but I almost put it in risk management in terms of having that ready. Because as you mentioned, Norsk Hydro actually got more plaudits for their work than they did, arrows at some point after the initial maybe 12 hours or so. Everyone was like, wow, they're really trying. Now, I don't think their response was necessarily so great, but their openness was really something.
Yeah, I think it was really good. And it's not what happens to you, it's how you handle it. I think that's
Yep.
one of the key parts. And of course,
Yep.
in some cases, if you handle it well, your stock can even go up versus down.
Yep. Dick Brooks has a win up. He says NIST SP 800 161 R2 is a big win for the C-SCRM implementation needed for Executive Order 14028. Oh my God, we have too many acronyms. That is really a mouthful. But thank you,
Yeah.
Dick.
Yeah, Dick, I
What
agree.
is
I think that's a win as
what
well. Yeah.
what is I don't know what C-SCRM is. What
That's
is
the
that?
supply chain risk management.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Thank you, Dick. Prediction. What's your prediction, Patrick?
It's a tired one, but I can't help but go back to it. OT ransomware. I think at some point we're going to see it making its way through the OT environment. Of course, it's not going to hit some devices because they just don't do that. But if there's something it can hit, I think we'll see it at some time. And I just keep waiting for the news to pop up one day when somebody gets it on that side and it turns into some raging inferno and it's a problem.
Interesting. Do you think it would be targeted OT ransomware or just leak in? I'm going to push you on your prediction.
Yes.
Both, huh?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that they're actively working on that. I mean, why wouldn't they? Right? Why wouldn't they work on targeted OT specific ransomware? I challenge anyone to show me that there's a reason not to do it.
Well, I can do that.
Let's go.
I think it might be considered. We even saw this with Colonial Pipeline. It might just be considered the blowback you're going to get might not be worth the money. You might say, look, if I attack these people, not much is going to happen to me. I'm not going to get governments trying to chase me down. If I attack this critical infrastructure, now there's a lot of ICS that are not critical infrastructure. So some manufacturing plant, I could see that very well happening.
Yeah. I mean, if you really just want the ransom or the extortion component, it may not be something that's that critical, but I still think it's going to hit at somewhere, sometime. It's going to be the leak in part, of course, is inevitable. At some point, that's just going to happen. I mean, the law of diffusion alone would apply. Right. But I think the will is just something targeted at some point. That is, if it's not specifically targeted at that company or at that tech, it's kind of OT general starting. I mean, you got to start somewhere with it. So obviously the targeted stuff, if you've really got an adversary that wants to do that, sure, they could probably do that. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Yeah. And it is, I guess, as you say that, it is noteworthy that some of the malware now includes in its generic search some ICS protocols and applications. They just add, when they see new things, they add it in, not necessarily thinking we're targeting OT. It's just, hey, we've seen this on systems. Let's see if we can find it other places and report back. I would actually think, though, OT targeted ransomware could be more likely to be a false flag sort of thing, where someone wants to attack a system, but they don't want to appear to be attacking it. So it's just ransomware. And by the way, it happened to take out this OT, but you get into all that spy versus spy stuff there. It gets
but it's a fantastic diversionary tactic. It really, really is. And we've used that in a lot of incident response exercises. When I do those with companies, is I'll use ransomware as the cover for what I'm really doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my prediction, I'm going to stick on the education side. And my prediction is we're going to start to see in this next year, in 2022, we're going to see probably for the next 2 to 5 years exponential growth in the ICS security programs and degrees out of universities. So we've seen big growth in private sector ICS security training. We've got a handful, and I've noted Sean McBride's efforts at Idaho State University, and there's a few other programs, but we'll see those at least doubling every year for the next few years, just because there's demand for those people, and universities will respond to demand, and it's such high priority. And I think that'll be a good thing. If that prediction comes true, that'll be a good thing.
Interesting. Okay, I would expect it to be slower, but we'll see. I honestly hope your prediction is right. I think that'd be fantastic.
Well, it's a little bit of cheating because it's coming from such a small base. So if you have like 5 programs and you get to 10, it's exponential in the first year. I
go from 1 to 2, you doubled your approach. So
yeah. So I think it's a pretty safe one in the early years. I think will it get up into the hundreds? Will it be something that most universities that have some sort of technical engineering program include? That's the bigger question, is how universal it'll get. Well, I think that's it for the month. Patrick, do you have people can find you where best? At Patrick C. Miller on Twitter? Where else should they look for you?
At Patrick C. Miller on Twitter, and of course, AmpereSec, or even patrickcmiller.com, either one. I'm pretty easy to find. Yeah.
And you're out speaking again now, right?
Yeah. I mean, since I got vaccinated back in like May, I've been on the road, whether it's speaking or at clients. So I'm traveling again. Yeah, and at S4, I'm looking forward to going to S4. I'll be there. We'll be doing the Beer ISAC and giving away the Beer ISAC Community Builder Award. And I wanted to personally thank you for doing the Women in ICS Day. I think that's fantastic. And I think that's really, I hope it makes a difference.
Yeah. I hope so too. I keep going back to whenever I hear workforce things, and I'll get this question sometimes in interviews and such. What do we need to do to grow the workforce? And I just say women.
Yeah.
I mean, women right now are about 10 to 15% of our space at best.
Yeah.
And, if we get that up to 30, 40, 50, that's how you get a lot more people that we need, is talented people to help us do the job. So there's fairness reasons, but there's also very pragmatic reasons why we need to solve this
all
problem.
the reasons. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you again. I look forward to seeing you in January, and everyone out there, thank you for your comments and questions. You can always email us at s4@digitalbond.com. And if you have a question for a non-live version, you can go to dale-peterson.com and record your question. That's it for now. Everyone have a good holiday.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.